Anthony Ingraffea is a Dwight C. Baum Professor of Engineering and Weiss Presidential Teaching Fellow at Cornell University. He also serves as the President of Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for Health Energy Incorporated. He is best known for his co-authorship of the 2011 Cornell University study entitled Methane and the Greenhouse Gas Footprint of Natural Gas from Shale Formations, that established the greenhouse gas footprint of fracking as being greater than that of any other fossil fuel, including coal. Dr. Ingraffea has been a principal investigator on research and development projects funded through such agencies as the National Science Foundation, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, the Gas Research Institute, Sandia National Laboratories, General Dynamics, Boeing, BP, and Exxon. You might have noticed from the list of the funding agencies that Dr. Ingraffea could actually be considered an industry insider, having spent a large portion of his scientific career studying the potential to extract energy from rock. His doctoral thesis was, in fact, on crack propagation in rock. This also means that he's somewhat uniquely qualified to discuss the basic topic we are presenting here today, high-volume hydraulic fracturing, aka hydrofracking. The Chautauqua watershed, and you wanted to say a little bit about the watershed?
Sure. We have a mission to preserve and enhance the water quality, scenic beauty, and ecological health of the lakes, streams, and watersheds of Chautauqua County. We're a county-wide organization, and certainly this issue has a lot of potential economic impacts, both positive and negative for our region, and it touches every part of our mission, the scenic beauty, the water quality, and the ecological health of our region. So we're very interested in learning as much as possible about this topic and informing as many of you as possible about this topic.
The topic tonight is not fracking. Notice the word fracking is not in the title. Oh, okay. It's just that hydrofracking is a small part of the story. Are you surprised? I thought you came here to hear about fracking. Yeah, you're going to hear a little bit about fracking. The story is the complete title to the talk, which is Unconventional Development of Methane, Shale Gas, Natural Gas, Methane, CH4 for those of you who are chemically inclined, from what I'm calling ultra-high volume fracking from clustered multi-well pads with long laterals. Now, you didn't know it, but that's the problem you came here tonight to hear me talk about. You've heard the word fracking, and you've assumed that fracking was the problem. But I'm going to try to convince you tonight that fracking is a very small part of a much larger problem. We've misnamed the problem. And my primary objective tonight is to try to inform you why that misnaming has led many of us, myself included initially, in the wrong direction, looking for problems that weren't there, when there were problems right in front of our eyes that we should have seen. So what we're going to talk about tonight is the complete title. I've also included in the title two words, a myth and a reality. A myth is a myth. It's something that might have a kernel of truth associated with it, but it's been embellished. Something else has been added to the truth to make it larger or different than the truth. Reality is truth. So I'm going to use my talk tonight to try to explain why things like climate change or leaking wells or surface impact have been mythologized by the oil and gas industry. What I'm going to try to do is show you where the truth to the myths are, the truths to the myths are, and why the myths have been embellished, why there's more to the truth than you need, there's more about the truth you need to know. So I've picked 4 myths. Pick more, could pick different, and depending upon the questions I get from you, we might go off in entirely different directions. I'm prepared to try to go in any direction you want me to go tonight. But here are 4 statements. Go ahead and read them. And be willing to bet that most of you have heard versions of each of those 4 statements in the last 3 or 4 years. And each of those statements as it's written is true. So each of these statements is true as it's written, and I'm going to tell you what's true about them, but I'm also going to tell you what the embellishments are. So the industry uses these statements to try to convince you that shale gas development in New York State is safe, that it has negligible, mitigatable, inconsequential impact on human health and the environment and climate. That's the purpose of these myths. So I'm going to try to expose what's true about these and then also talk to you about what's not true about them so you can decide for yourselves tonight based on those statements by the industry and my elucidation of what's not completely true about them. You can decide for yourself what's true, what's myth, and what's reality. That's the motif for tonight. That's the mechanism. And by the way, I could have put another bullet down here that says, shale gas makes the United States energy independent. Or I could have said, shale gas makes the United States energy secure. Those are two other comments you've been hearing recently. They've been invented by the industry as what I refer to as making it up as you go along. You didn't hear those things said 4 or 5 years ago. You only heard them in the last 4 or 5 months because they have to have another excuse to produce shale gas because the old excuses, which is we're all going to get rich, don't work anymore. So here we go. You ready? Let's start with this one. Fracking, and that's the correct spelling, by the way. Commercial grade fracking for oil and gas development has been in use since the late 1940s. It's well proven. The implication of that statement is nothing goes wrong. And the fracking that's been used for 60 years all around the world is the same fracking that might come to Chautauqua County. And the kind of fracking we're talking about tonight has never been in Chautauqua County. It's never been anywhere in New York State. It's in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Texas, Colorado, Louisiana, Arkansas, but it's never been in New York State. So what's so different? Why should I worry about this different, new kind of fracking? That's the first thing I'm going to try to explain to you. So producing methane from shale gas is called an unconventional play. That's industry terminology. It's unconventional because the shale itself is impermeable. That's a fancy word for saying that fluids like gas don't want to flow out of it. It's hard to accept that shale, which has a lot of gas in it, is impermeable and you can't get the gas out of it. Impermeable means gas can't flow through it. Well, how are we going to solve that problem? We're going to see how we're going to solve that problem by using, for the first time, starting 6 years ago, not in 1947, 6 years ago, started by combining 4 technologies, some of which had existed, some of which had to be invented. But the combination of these 4 technologies, which I'm about to explain to you, is the necessary key to unlocking the economic viability of a shale gas well. I'll say that another way. Without the use of all 4 of these technologies, you can't get gas out of a shale and make money at it. And even with these 4 technologies, you still might not make money at it because it's not just the technology that determines the price. So by explaining these 4 technologies, I'm going to give you a basic lesson. This is Shale Gas Development 101. We're all going to have a graduate degree by the time we're done tonight, but we start at the freshman level. So why is this thing called directional drilling important and absolutely necessary to get gas out of shale? I'll explain each of those technologies in turn using a series of photographs, pictures, and videos. Directional drilling. You've heard that to get gas out of shale, you not only have to drill down, you have to drill out. Why? Shale is a sedimentary rock. It's laid down in layers, and typically the layers are on the order of 100 feet thick, 50 feet, 100 feet, 200 feet, but not thousands of feet. But to get to a shale layer, you might have to drill down a mile or more, depending upon where you are. If we wanted to get to the Utica, under where we are right now, you'd have to go down 7,000 feet. But if you just drilled a traditional vertical well, like any of the thousands of wells within 100 miles of where we're sitting, there are thousands of wells. Vast majority of those were just a straight down or more or less straight down hole into a big pocket of gas, or a no pocket of gas. How many people here have dry wells on their property? Or dead, dry holes? Either you hit a pocket or you didn't. That's conventional drilling. Unconventional means, among other things, for shale, you have to drill down and then expose your well to as much of the shale as possible. Makes no sense to drill directly into the shale, then you only have maybe 100 feet of your well exposed to the shale. And the gas in the shale is not in a big pocket. Not even in a series of big pockets. Not in a series of small pockets. It's in an infinite series of microscopic pockets. Can't see them with the naked eye. The gas is distributed throughout the shale at the submicron level. The idea then is to make as much of the well as possible get exposed to as much shale as possible. So a modern shale gas well now might go down a mile and out 2 miles. Wow, 2 miles of the well exposed to the shale. Without directional drilling, you can't do that. Directional drilling has been around since the 70s. It's not a new technology. But it was one of the 4 components of technology that had to be combined to unlock the secret of shale gas production. Second technology, the ability to inject very high volumes of fracking fluid. What's high? High is a relative term. Up until last year in New York State, even though we didn't have regulations, we only have regulation by permit, it was an unwritten understanding on the part of the New York State DEC and the oil and gas industry that they could never use more than 80,000 gallons of frack fluid in a well. 80,000 gallons. Unwritten rule, everybody understood, that was it. But to make a shale gas well productive, as you'll see, you're going to need 5, 10, 15, 20 million gallons of frack fluid. 2 orders of magnitude more. Not 10 times, 100 times more frack fluid. Why? All right, to understand why you need so much more frack fluid, let's take a visit down. Except we really can't get down there, nobody can. So we'll do the next best thing. We'll walk up a gorge in the Finger Lakes region. This is the Tegonic Gorge, there's Tegonic Falls up here. And you can walk up the creek, Tegonic Creek, and you're actually walking on a shale formation. It's been exposed. It's not the Marcellus, it's not the Utica, it's the Geneseo Burkett formation. And it's a black shale. It once had gas in it. What are these lines? They're fractures. Who put them there? How? Those are natural hydraulic fractures. What caused them? Gas pressure. This used to be buried thousands of feet underground. And it was a black shale, which means it had a lot of organics that were decomposing into methane, propane, butane, coal, oil, all the way up the chain. And at some point, somewhere in the last 300-400 million years, there was enough gas pressure that the rock self-fractured. Those are natural hydraulic fractures that occurred at 2 different epochs, a couple million years apart. Okay, so now we have a block of shale here, say that one, and it's impermeable. That means a methane molecule that's sitting right in the middle of that block would take years to get from the middle of that block to the edge. But a lot of the gas has already gotten to the edge and caused those fractures, and those fractures are full of gas because gas caused them. So the only way to make a shale deposit productive of natural gas is that it's already fractured. So humans don't hydraulically fracture shale, they hydraulically refracture shale. And in doing so, as I point out, it unlocks the gas that's currently stored in all these natural fractures where it went 300 million years ago to create them. Got that so far? That's Geology 101. Now, all we got to put together is 2 things so far. Directional drilling. So here's the lateral. Remember, this is the thing that can go out a mile or 2 miles. It's the lateral part of the well. And we drilled it through the shale. And we have all this gas that's collected in these natural fractures. But this is a steel pipe surrounded by cement. The steel pipe's about 4.5 inches in diameter, about 3/8 thick, and the cement's about 1 1/8 inch thick. How do you get the gas that's being stored in these natural fractures to get inside that pipe? No, first you got to poke holes in the pipe, right? stab that pipe. No. You perforate the pipe by putting small explosive charges or very high pressure water jets into that pipe. And remember, that pipe's maybe a mile down and 2 miles out. So how do you get shaped explosive charges, thousands of them, down in there so that you poke thousands of holes in that pipe? That's high technology. So now you poke a lot of holes in that steel pipe right through the cement and right into the shale. And what you want to now do is get the gas that's down in here to go into that pipe. The problem is that down there, 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet, there's a lot of pressure from the earth that's trying to squeeze the rock. And what you want to do is counter that pressure, so you open those cracks wide. And by wide, I mean the width of a sand grain. But Professor, that's not wide. Think like a methane molecule. That should be easy. Think, everybody imagine they're a CH4 molecule. How big are you? Compared to a sand grain is infinitely large compared to a methane molecule. Right? So if you can prop those cracks open with sand grains called proppant, which is part of what's injected into the frack fluid, sand grains or ceramic beads, then you've propped open those cracks and you allow the gas to flow back through those holes you popped in the pipe and up the lateral, along the lateral, up the vertical, into a gathering line, into a processing unit, into a compressor station, into a storage unit, into a transmission line, into city gate, into a distribution line, and into your home to heat your house. So you were a methane molecule and you were right here and you went along that natural fracture, got into that natural fracture because you now had a propped open superhighway from fracking. And off you go. It's the way it works. That's fracking 202. You're moving along. Yes? Under natural pressures?
Under natural pressure.
10,000 psi, 5,000 psi, 15,000 psi, depends upon the depth and how old the gas is, lithostatic stresses. So one of the things the operator has to do before fracking is to do a test to figure out what fracking pressure is necessary. Okay, so the whole idea is to create a flow network. Think of it as like a traffic flow. You want to get all the molecules that are stored in all these natural fractures moving back towards that well. Got it? Okay, so let's go back to our list. High frac fluid volumes. Why do we need a lot of frac fluid? Well, if this thing is a mile long and there's about 3 feet between each crack, how many cracks are you going to encounter? 1,600 of them. How much of each of those cracks do you want to open? Thousands of square yards. How much fluid is that going to take? 5 to 10 million gallons. Okay, there you go. That's why you need high frac fluid volumes. You're doing not one fracture, like the wells around here that were fracked in sandstone or limestone. There was one crack created by hydrofracturing. One vertical, two-winged, more or less elliptical crack. So you don't need very much fluid. Here you're creating or reopening thousands of cracks over a very large area. Okay, now we just invented another problem. So high frac fluid volumes had not been used until about the late 1990s. That's relatively new. How do you pump 1 million gallons of frac fluid 3 miles through a pipe 4.5 inches in diameter at 10,000 pounds per square inch in 1 hour? How much horsepower on the pump at the surface? 3 horsepower Briggs & Stratton? 300 horsepower on the pumper truck from your volunteer fire company? Try 10,000 horsepower, and then it still won't work because you can't pump that much fluid that long distance through a small diameter pipe that rapidly without losing all of the energy because of friction between the water and the pipe. Yeah, there's friction between water and steel. So the chemists had to come along and invent something new that had not existed until about the mid-1990s called slick water. Slick water means slippery water. You add a lubricant to the water to make it more slippery. That drastically reduces the horsepower necessary at the surface to do all this pumping. Now you're down to 10,000 horsepower. I'll show you a picture of what 10,000 horsepower looks like in pumps in a minute. So that was a new technology. That's only about 15 years old. This is 30 or 40 years old. This is relatively recent. But those three together did not unlock the key. And that was not the key to unlock shale gas. somebody had to invent the idea of multi-well pads and cluster drilling. What's that? Once again, I'm going to show pictures. So anybody who's seen a 3D movie recently? Go to the movie theater, you put the glasses on, everything looks 3D. That's what these guys are doing. See the glasses? They're in a cave, a virtual reality cave, and they're looking at a 3D movie. They're actually inside of it. Here's the surface of Tioga County, Pennsylvania. This is the stratigraphy, the layout of all the rock units between the surface all the way down to the Marcellus. Here's a region of the Marcellus they're talking about. These blue lines are the vertical part of a well. These are the laterals. And they're actually discussing how to design the wells. That's high tech. These guys have PhDs. They're sitting in Oklahoma City or Houston, and they're designing the wells in Pennsylvania using the latest technology. I know, that's what I did for 20 years. Here's another view of the same thing. And I'm going to use it to try to explain what I mean by multiple horizontal wells, some clusters of pads. Here's a topographical map of a portion of Tioga County, Pennsylvania. This gray blob is the upper surface of the Marcellus shale formation under Tioga County, Pennsylvania. And you'll notice it's not perfectly flat, it's not uniform, it's got major faults running through it. And each one of what appears to be a single vertical is actually multiple verticals. So there would be a pad here, that's the area on the surface where the drilling and fracking occurs. And this one yellow line is actually 6 verticals. They're only about 10 feet apart. So they drill one vertical, turn it lateral, move 10 feet, drill another vertical, turn it lateral. Multi-well pad. So that pad has 6 wells on it. This pad has 5 wells on it. This pad only has 1 well on it. This pad so far only has 1 well. But here's the obvious thing going on. There's gas everywhere in here. And for those of you who are business people, you know that if you keep all your product in the warehouse, you got nothing to sell. So here's the warehouse. You got to get all the gas out, or as much as you can. And to do that, you have to drill everywhere. So the objective is to pattern through clustered multi-well pads this entire volume of rock, like this. This is incomplete, what you're looking at here. Trying to give you the scope and scale of what you'd expect to see in New York, which is what you would see in certain regions of Pennsylvania and Texas right now, which would be totally different than anything that's happened in this area before. I'm very much aware that there are 40,000 oil and gas wells in the history of New York, most of them within 100 miles of where we're sitting. None of them use this technology. This is Chesapeake's beautiful bucolic version of what this would look like. Here's a cluster of pads, pad, 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 a nice uniform grid from each pad. In this case, there are 6 wells, and everything looks gorgeous, very minimal surface impact. That's not a photograph. That's an artist's rendition. I'll show you what it really looks like in a few minutes. All right, let me show you what it looks like in Texas. The first shale gas play was in the Barnett Shale gas, a little bit northwest of the cities of Dallas and Fort Worth. This is the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. Back in 2006, 2007, the cities of Dallas and Fort Worth entered into a leasing agreement with Chesapeake. And they agreed to lease the entire property of the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport to Chesapeake for gas development from the Barnett Shale. City of Pittsburgh is doing the same thing right now with Consol. So I'm going to change the picture now. That's what it looks like to the board of directors of Chesapeake. Each one of those red dots is a pad. Each one of these red lines is a lateral. That's spatially intense development. Remember, the idea is there's gas everywhere in that Barnett Shale, so drill everywhere. That's not what we have around here. I don't have the answer off the top of my head, but I can guess that the average Barnett shale well, and these are pretty modern because these were done in the last 5 or 6 years, the average Barnett shale well produces in its lifetime about 1.5 billion cubic feet of natural gas. So there's probably something like 60 or 70 wells there. So over the lifetime of those wells, you'd produce something like 100 billion cubic feet of gas. Is that a big number? Well, what's 100 billion? 100 billion, if you had dollars, would be a big number. Yes? What's the sequestration amount? Isn't it 85 billion per year for the next 10 years? That's a big number, but it's a tiny amount of gas. The U.S. consumes 23 trillion cubic feet of gas per year. So the total production from that total property is a very small percentage of 1 year's consumption in the U.S. So be careful with big numbers. You have to always have a relative standard for those. Good question. So far, so good. A+ so far. All right, so that's what it looks like in reality. And let me summarize on this myth. Remember, the myth was fracking is 60 years old, it's well proven, what are you worried about? But the kind of thing we're talking about is not just fracking. It's a much bigger fracking, but it's in the context of spatially intense development involving clustered pads, many wells per pad. Each well is 100 times more consumptive of frack fluid and is producing on the order of 100 times more waste than any well you've ever seen in New York State. Let me put it this way. If you took all 40,000 oil and gas wells that have ever been drilled in New York State and added up all the frack fluid that was used to frack every one of those wells, that same amount of frack fluid would be consumed by the first 3,000 shale gas wells. It's big. So there's the myth. It's meant to calm you. It's meant to tell you, don't worry, we know what we're doing. But what they're doing has never been done in New York. It's only been done in the entire United States since 2007 in its entirety. And so they're still learning. This is a young technology. It's still evolving. It's not 60 years of experience and good feeling and security. It's 6 or 7 years of let's figure out how this works. We're going to make a lot of mistakes along the way, and we'll try to fix things as we move along. New York State is in an unusual situation. As you know, we don't permit it yet. So what has New York State learned from shale gas development in 5 other states? There have been about 25,000 shale gas wells in the U.S. total. What have we learned? That's a rhetorical question. So what? What's the impact of what I just said, this mythologizing of a basic truth? Well, we haven't had sufficient time to conduct all the scientific investigations that should have been conducted before the other states said, go for it. And New York put itself in a position 4 years ago by saying, wait, not yet, to allow time for those scientific investigations to be done. Those scientific investigations include impact of waste, impact of accidents, economic, sociologic, climate change impacts, and long-term human health impacts. We don't have finished studies in any of those areas yet. That's all new science. So we were smart. New York State was smart 4.5 years ago. I know there are some landowners that think they were really stupid because they wanted to cash in when there was cash to be made. But if you're a landowner right now and you would like to start producing shale gas from your property, that's the last thing you want to do. You ain't going to make any money. You might have got a signing bonus for leasing, but you ain't going to get any royalties. Every dry gas well that's producing in the United States right now is losing money. $3.34 a thousand, I think, today. Break even in the Marcellus is on the order of 4. So we need more time to figure this all out. Don't set policy before you understand the results of all the scientific studies. Myth number 1. Myth number 2. The use of multi-well pads and cluster drilling reduces surface impacts. You now know what a multi-well pad is. It's a pad from which there are many wells, not one. Many, 5, 10, 15, 20. And you know what cluster drilling means. Roughly uniform array of pads clustered on the surface so that you can access all the gas that you can possibly get out of a wide area of shale. The purpose of this statement is to tell us, make us believe that if they allow multi-well pads and clusters, that that's going to have less surface impact than if they did something else. So I bet the average IQ in this room is at least 142. I can tell. So let's do some logical analysis here. Is it possible to reduce surface impact to less than 0? How much surface impact do we have from shale gas development right now in New York State? None. So how can doing this result in less impact than we have? Okay, well, obviously they want us to think something else because that's obviously a stupid thing, right? The oil and gas industry would never expect us to believe something that's stupid. Well, yes, they would, but anyway. So what they want us to think is, look, if you don't allow us to use clustered pads with multiple wells, what we'll do is what we always did in Chautauqua County. We'll go out and we'll clear an area about the size of this room and we'll drill a single well. And we'll get down to the shale. And then we'll go down maybe 100 yards away, drill another pad, put another pad in, drill a single well. Operators are never going to do that. That doesn't make money. I just got through telling you the only way to make money is to have multiple wells in one pad. Think of what it would take to create a pad, move in all the equipment to drill a well on this pad, move in all the frac equipment to frac the well on this pad, put all the ancillary infrastructure, all the gathering lines and compressor stations to serve one well on one pad, and then move 200 yards away and do it again? They'd never do it. So what are they asking us to believe? They wouldn't do what they want us to, what they're saying they would do if we don't allow them to do that. But if we allow them to do that, there is surface impact that we don't have. So there's my logical argument for why this is absurd. Let me give you physical arguments next. Remember that pretty picture from Chesapeake of what clustered pad arrangement looked like? Let's look at what it really looks like. First, we'll go to northeastern British Columbia. Not many people have been there, right? Anybody ever visited northeastern British Columbia? That's what it looks like. Do you notice all the resistance groups and grassroots organizations that have gathered to try to resist? This is where the industry is doing its state-of-the-art experiments in fracking for shale gas, for the obvious reason.
And what stage is this?
This is the fracking stage for this pad. So they've already drilled 16 wells in this pad. And they're in the process of fracking each of those 16 wells. And here are the statistics on that pad. This is state of the art. The larger the pad, the more wells on the pad, the longer the laterals on the pad, the more production you get. That's what the industry is learning. You don't have to believe me. You can go read the industry trade journals, which I do every day. So this was state of the art a year ago, and this is what the industry is moving towards as its standard. Many wells in one pad, large pad, long laterals, lots of materials.
And how long does that stay looking like that?
As long as it takes them to create the pad, drill the 16 wells, and frack the 16 wells. And now you're going to say, how long does that take? In an experiment like this, they probably did that in a period of 2 or 3 years. But every place else where it's not an experiment, it's part of production, the period of time that you'd have activity on this pad depends upon capital availability. Ooh, what does Professor Ingraffea know about capital integrity? My PhD was in rock fracture mechanics. What can I possibly know about capital availability? Let me tell you what I know. How much does it cost to drill and frack every one of those wells? Anybody know? What's the average cost to drill and frack a shale gas well in Pennsylvania today? $6 million. $6 million. Well, at $3 a thousand, you barely break even. Okay, if it costs $6 million, which company do you know has, in this case, 6 times 16, $96 million in its pocket ready to invest? How many companies in the face of the earth can do that, other than Exxon, BP? Where do all the other companies get the capital to do that? Investors. They borrow it. They go to Wall Street and say, hey, we can give you a 5% return on your investment, 10%, 15%. You loan us the money, we'll drill the well, we'll produce the gas, we'll sell it at the profit, we'll pay back the loan. That's the way America works. Okay. So if a company wants to drill 16 wells on a pad and they don't have $96 million plus to drill 16 wells, they won't drill 16 wells right away. They only drill as many wells as they have capital to drill. And no company is only going to own one pad, except the bottom feeders. So another good question. Let me show you from Pennsylvania and from West Virginia what typical operations look like. Here's a 5-well pad. These wells have been drilled and fracked. These are vestigial ponds that were first used to store fresh water, then used to store drilling mud, and then later used to store flowback. That's the fluid that comes back up the well after the frac job, flowback fluid, which is later then called brine and then later called produced water. I joke that that fluid can't possibly know what its name is. Therefore, what's in it is what's in it, regardless of what we call it. So when you hear about brine spreading, it's flowback spreading. Flowback, the exact second that an operator declares a well in operation, in production, what was being called flowback automatically by regulation in Pennsylvania is called brine. And I assert that the fluid and the chemicals in it don't know what they're called from one second to another. It's still fluid that's flowing back out of the well.
Those are all fluid, right?
Well, what comes back out of the well is water, a lot of sand, some of the chemicals that you put into the frac fluid, and whatever that water combination accumulated while it was underground during the frac job and thereafter. And that fluid keeps coming back in decreasing quantities over the life of the well. So it has absorbed salts, NaCl, KCl. It's absorbed heavy metals, which are in the Marcellus, and in some cases it has absorbed naturally occurring radioactive materials. By law, it's not called a hazardous material. It's part of federal regulations. You can't call...
Hydrochloric acid and benzene?
Hydrochloric acid is typically, but not always, used as the acid in a frac job. All frac jobs that I know of contain an acid at some point to clear out.
Hazardous materials?
Not when it comes back up out of a well. By federal regulation, you can't call it a hazardous material. I'm sorry, I'm not the lawyer here. I'm not the legislature. I'm telling you what the law is, but if you want to change it, you know how to do it. Okay, here's a typical pad nowadays. This is a 7-well pad. You'll notice that this is not a clearing like the one you have out in the middle of a cornfield here. That's 15, 20 acres of forest clearing. A lot of trees down. Okay, industry keeps moving along, and if we were in Texas, that water is all coming from deep aquifers. That is briny water from 10, 20, 30,000 feet down pumped to the surface. Because there are not large rivers and finger lakes in Texas, especially the last couple years. They have a little drought problem. In Pennsylvania, a lot of that water comes out of the Susquehanna River. Susquehanna River Basin Commission permits withdrawals from the Susquehanna of large quantities of water under permit. And initially, it's trucked in. In some cases where an operator is going to have a large number of wells and pads in an area, they'll build temporary pipelines. And they'll build a very large reservoir that's capable of storing enough water to frack multiple wells. So it's...
The water comes back up in decreasing amounts?
Yes. Let me explain. So imagine we pumped 5 million gallons collectively into one well to frack it. Some of that water, fluid, frac fluid, comes back up the well in the first few days in very large rates, hundreds of gallons per minute. Okay. As time goes on, that rate at which that fluid comes back declines because you're running out of the fluid that was down there and the pressure is dropping, and a lot of that fluid gets absorbed by the shale. So you've heard it said that not all the stuff they pump down comes back. Some wells return 90%, some wells return 9% of what goes down. On average, 25, 30% of what you pump down comes back up before the well is declared in production. Do you hear what I just said? There's always something coming up, even the last day that the well is in production. It might only be a gallon or two, but there's always something coming up with the gas. Some fluid. It just comes up at decreasing rates. But the longer it's been down there, the longer it's been absorbing what's been down there. So the chemical makeup of what comes up is constantly changing. So the rate at which it comes up is decreasing, the concentration of the bad stuff is increasing. which is why if we now declare what's coming back up brine, in some cases you can get a beneficial use permit and use it for road spreading. Is it flowback? Yeah, of course it's flowback. Is it brine? Legally it's brine. What is it? It's flowback. Okay, I want to show some of the other ancillary stuff on the surface because too many times people just concentrate on a well. They think shale gas and they have a mental image of a well. And I've already told you that that's crazy because there is no such thing as a well. Even on one pad there's going to be multiple wells. But in addition to the wells, there's what I call ancillary infrastructure on the surface. Other stuff you got to have to produce the gas. We're starting to see some of that stuff here. So here's a 7-well pad. Here are condensate tanks for collecting natural gas liquids and brine. Here is an impoundment dam and an impoundment pond to store the flowback that came out of those wells. Typically, a company now might choose to recycle some of its flowback waste. To do that, they will store it temporarily in a large open pit. This allegedly is not going to be permitted in New York. We'll see. And then it's taken to a place where it's recycled. It's processed chemically and physically to make it useful for the next frac job. That's good. It's a good thing to do, and it should be a required regulation in New York State. It isn't. In the proposed regulations that we just got rid of 2 weeks ago to start over again, it's suggested that operators recycle. All right, here's another slide that shows some of the other ancillary infrastructure, compressor stations. Depending upon the pressure of the gas coming out of the well, which is constantly decreasing in time, you have to compress the gas coming out of the well to get it up to a pressure amenable to go into a transmission pipeline. Transmission pipelines are the transcontinental pipelines or interstate pipelines that take large quantities of gas through 36-inch diameter, 42-inch diameter pipelines at 1,000 pounds per square inch. The gas coming out of the wells is not coming out at 1,000 psi. So you got to pump up the pressure. That's done with a compressor station. So there are 3, 4, 5, 6, 3,500 horsepower reciprocating pumps in here running 24/7, 365. They're noisy and they off gas. Processing facility. If the gas coming out is wet, that doesn't mean it's got water in it. It means it's got natural gas liquids in it. Propane, butane, ethane, all the way up the amine stream. You have to process the gas to get those liquids separated so that you have methane going in one pipeline, propane going to a truck, butane going to a truck. So that's like a mini refinery. And what you can't see here are all the pipelines connecting all this.
Excuse me, on that pad, on that picture, you had all those wells, where it says wells?
Yep.
Well?
Yep.
Is that multiple?
Multiple wells.
pads?
Multiple wells.
So those are really wells. So that's what the pad
Yep.
looks like after it's all done.
Depending upon the number of wells.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's several wells on
Yep.
as well.
Exactly. Okay. All this operation on the surface, as I just said, is expensive. To drill a well, $5 to $6 million. So you can't afford to shut things down very long at any time. Only under the most dire circumstances would you tell the crew to go home. So in general, it's 24/7, 365, drilling and fracking. So here's a midwinter, this is last month in Pennsylvania. And if you count them, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's 14 1,000 horsepower pumps on that site. So 24/7, 365 means the light pollution, this has to be lit up like daytime at night, and the noise pollution is there as long as these operations are going on.
Those are diesel-driven pumps.
Diesel-driven pumps.
Must go through a lot of diesel fuel.
Goes through a lot of diesel fuel. And again, it should be a I'm going to recite for you tonight regulations that I would write. Every state in the country right now is claiming it has the toughest regulations. I have the toughest regulations. It shall be required in the state of New York for all oil and gas operations that any engines for the purpose of creating a pad, drilling a well, fracking a well, or transporting the product of a well shall be run on natural gas. It's a simple regulation. Well, they could, right? They could. They could. That would be green. All right, where can they put pads? Yeah. Where can they put the pads? Well, there's some places, obviously, where things are too steep, but if things are too steep, you can always take the top off of a mountain. That's a real photograph. Or you can extend out from the side of a mountain and build a pad, or you can carve into the side of a mountain and build a pad. So the point is, as I said before, and I'll say again, the gas is everywhere. You want to drill everywhere. You want to put a pad in as close as possible to your regular pattern on the surface. And you'll do everything you can to move mountains or create mountains or remove mountaintops to get the pads in the best possible locations. All right. I showed you what it looked like at the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. What I'm going to try to do now is allow you to visualize as best I can what this whole forward technology process would look like if it comes to New York. To understand that, I have to give you a little bit of background on the rules in New York. And as you know, right now we are regulationless. DEC tried to create regulations for shale gas development and failed. We're back square one. We've got to start over again. So right now, New York State has no regulations, technical regulations with regards to shale gas development. But there are permitting conditions. Okay. The permitting conditions require, by New York State law, an operator, a company seeking to develop the gas, to define what's called a spacing unit. It's called a production unit in other states. It's a spacing unit. It's an area on the surface, something like a rectangle, not necessarily rectangular. And the company has to design that spacing unit to conform to the geology and its operations. So for example, in this case, Chesapeake wanted a permit to put this spacing unit in south central New York. They wanted to put a pad right here and drill 5 wells north-northwest and 5 wells south-southeast. And the direction of those wells is to intersect as many as possible of those natural hydraulic fractures that I showed you. So the direction of the spacing unit is controlled by the geology. The shape is controlled by the technology. You want to drill a lateral that's a mile long here and a mile long here, so you need a pad or a spacing unit that's 2 miles long. If you want to drill 5 wells in each direction with 500 feet between them, you need about a half-mile wide spacing unit. 2 miles by half a mile is a square mile, is 640 acres, which just happens to be the legal limit in New York State now. It was raised in 2008 to accommodate this technology. The operator also has to get the agreement of the people who live inside here. Do you know how that works? You know about compulsory integration? So an operator can get a permit to drill in this spacing unit if and only if the operator has received the consent of people who control at least 60% of the land in that spacing unit. The people who control the other 40% do not have a say, yes or no. Once 60% of the land is controlled by landowners who have said yes, the other 40% are compulsorily integrated, which means that the gas under their land can be taken and they have to be recompensed for that, but at the legal lowest limit for royalties, 12.5%. And they can prohibit surface trespass. That's the law in Pennsylvania and New York. It's different in Pennsylvania. So given that, let's imagine that we were on the southern tier of New York, 50, 60 miles southeast of here. And this is what it would look like in the ideal situation where there's no empty space left. You drill everywhere. Each one of these yellow rectangles is a spacing unit that's 2 miles by half a mile. Each red block is a well pad, and there are your wells coming off your well pads. So there is multi-well clustered pad arrangement, and that would extract as much gas as they possibly could from under this region. So I'm just mapping onto a region of New York State what you saw on the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. This is what it looks like in Pennsylvania right now. Tioga County. Here's the New York-Pennsylvania border. This is a map created by Shell for the EPA, which shows all of the Shell lease holdings in Tioga County. This is Shell only. There are 65 to 70 other operators leased in Pennsylvania. So Shell has defined all these as spacing units. They're more or less rectangular. They're more or less north, northwest, south, southeast. Each black dot is the location or future location of a pad. So if that's happening just south of the border, it doesn't take too much imagination to imagine that's what's going to happen north of the border. So it's spatially intense development. And remember, it's not spatially intense like you have here, where you might have the remnants of a single conventional gas well in the middle of every cornfield within 20 miles of here. It's the much larger infrastructure I just showed you, because each well is longer, deeper, requiring much more fracking, and there are many wells per pad. I'm sorry, say again?
Depth. So if I'm going to chase Marcellus, what is the depth in this county?
Too shallow, mostly. The proposed regulations, which are now going to be redone, the proposed regulations in New York State said that shale gas development in New York State shall not occur unless the top of the shale formation is a minimum of 1,000 feet below the bottom of fresh water. And the bottom of fresh water shall be assumed to be 1,000 feet below the surface, which means you couldn't tap into a Marcellus shale any shale formation that was shallower than 2,000 feet below the surface. I didn't check before I came here, but I imagine that we're probably right at 2,000 feet here, but the Utica is another 4,000 feet deeper. Utica is actually producing in Ohio, and Utica has been producing in Quebec and Ontario. There have been experimental Utica wells in New York, but they haven't been high volume because that would violate the current prohibitions. So there have been vertical, what are called mini frac wells, where they'll frac with a few hundred gallons of fluid in order to figure out what the stress state is down there and what the total organic content is. But certainly Utica. And there are other possible shale formations in between. 3 and 4? Thank you. You're a geologist? Okay. So if it's between 3 and 4 here, it's conceivably tappable. So the Utica is a big unknown in New York State. We don't know how productive it's going to be. We don't know whether it's going to be mostly wet, mostly dry. We don't know where the hot spots are. That's to be determined. That myth was the use of multi-well pads and cluster drilling reduces surface impacts. Well, judge for yourself. I think the truth is that the use of multi-well pads and cluster drilling facilitates and prolongs intense industrialization and leaves a larger long-term footprint. So what? Why should I be worried about this? It has a health impact, multiple health impacts. Long-term noise, dust, and light pollution from the pads while they're drilling and fracking. That might elongate out to years. NOx emissions from all the diesel engines that are running. Higher probabilities of spills of frack fluid. When you're dealing with millions or tens of millions of gallons on a pad, transporting back and forth and storing, the probability of a spill goes up. And venting and accidental emissions of produced gases, and that's the next thing we're going to talk about, because we're going to go to myth number 3.